Good morning and welcome. It's over to our poet, Emma Mabie.
The foundation of our house was built on an anthem. The anthem was a prayer our hearts rendered in the language of silence. The rooms reflect our hearts, with no light, no warmth. The floors balance the stones our souls carry. Flowers withered by bitter breath. Cold crawls over us and nibbles at our seams. We never knew lack until poverty found residency in our mouths. Despondency has been rattling the door's hinges. Notwithstanding that, tonight we're hosting a dinner to find out how we got here, how we have come to this house, come I see you, to further life or to end it. Who bribed us into deserting our lifeline? We asked all and sundry to come dine with us, a night that stretched for 26 years. We served organic suggestions that night, topped with rhetorical questions. These guests are not here to eat the plight of our life's stories, to hear how we are not living to go to heaven, but to not look at every meal as though it's the Last Supper. We all keep glancing at equality with faint smiles, trying to ignore how we became victimized by the spoils of a struggle. No one often reminds the once oppressed how tyrannical giants fall. So when fortune favors them, greed has them inflating, bursting beyond their bellies. Illusions of democracy attempt to open my mouth, but reality has this tongue feeling like a severed limb. There are gaps in this conversation of intellectual liberation that have our voices shifting as tectonic plates. Until for the time uttered his only words that evening, my people are destroyed for lack of knowledge. Abruptly, labor shouted to capitalism. This forged long-run romance between us and progress is no longer glue that keeps this house together. You have redefined moral hazards, dealt a hand to hedge everything but the people. With a smug, capitalism retorted, "Don't feed on what you can't fund." The futurist put on his contact lens to comment. This house is on fire. All present are flooding it with emptiness, drenching every space with blood clots to save its foundation. Tip the scales. Sorrow has assaulted your lungs for far too long. Deflate into a readiness to flow. Teach the mind so the heart may preserve its lessons. Our minds are gifts. Earth acknowledges our presence. And so the next day, we spring cleaned, dusted off distrust, washed the years of betrayal off the walls, washed inequality off our skin, watched injustice flow out the baths, and see it drain stagnation's throat. To hear our own esophagus emphasize the echo of victories our stomachs are yet to clasp. Soak ourselves in knowledge from Urban Festival 2020, embracing our best ideals which await in plenty. We will refurnish every room with lived experience, embedded in the sight of memory, not yet sung of us.
Good morning and welcome to Urban Festival 2020, the session on creative procurement for empowering the civic. We're going to have an official welcome from Danga in a minute, but as Danga gets ready to welcome you, it would be great if he had a sense of who's in the room. So I'm going to ask you just to use the chat function to please introduce yourself, name, organization, and maybe one sentence about why you've chosen to join the session. My name is Rehana. I'm a research associate at the South African Cities Network, working predominantly with the Built Environment Program, but also with the governance program and the comms program at Cities Network from time to time. And this is actually, this session is co-hosted by the Built Environment Program and governance program at South African Cities Network. So please use the chat function to introduce yourself, and Danga, over to you for the official welcome.
Great, thank you, Rihanna. Hello and good morning. My name is Danga Muwowo. I am the Program Manager for Well-Governed Cities at the South African Cities Network. And along with my colleagues Kayla and Rihanna, who you've just heard from, I'd like to thank you for joining us in this Urban Festival session titled Creative Procurement for Empowering the Civic. This year's Urban Festival theme is an exploration into how the physical and virtual world can be harnessed to engage people in reimagining and shaping their own cities, both in these strange and uncertain COVID-19 times and into the future. This is a two-part session that will explore ethical, transparent, and creative procurement processes to allow for communities to both participate more actively in public procurement processes and hold municipalities and service providers accountable. The session's framing is through an economic transformation lens, as well as a public integrity and governance lens. In the first part, we'll show a 20-minute video clip of contributions from Professor Jaap de Visser, Chris Dobie, Nontando Ngamlana, Zukiswa Kota, Bernie Dolly, Sasha Hasselmeyer, and Professor Stephen Friedman. Most of them are present with us and will be part of the open and interactive discussion that makes up the second part of the session, facilitated by Rihanna. First of all, just to start off with a couple of agreements and technical arrangements. We'll be using Zoom and screen sharing to a mural board to capture the inputs during this session, and Kayla will be managing that board. We request your permission to record the session. We ask you to please keep your microphone off when not speaking, and we ask you also to use the chat to post technical questions only. Questions and comments will be invited in by Rihanna. We very much want this to be an open discussion. We want engagement, and we want to encourage you to participate. And you'll be asked to raise your virtual hand and wait to be called to unmute and voice your comments. And at the end of the session, evaluation forms will be posted in the chat, and we ask you to fill those in, please, so we know how we did. Well, without further ado then, can we get started? If I could ask my colleague Sean to play the video clip, please.
So Danga, just before Sean plays the video clip, as part of the framing of the session, we had some interesting responses from people who we asked to send us video clips, and particularly a sentiment that suggested that in hosting a session on creative procurement, we're actually anti-transparency, accountability, and we're almost, I think the response was, it sounds the same as creative accounting. So just want to emphasize that, you know, we remain committed as the convening team to all of those issues. And Kayla, maybe just as part of the framing for you to give a quick sense of, you know, Setopoly and some of what Setopoly had raised in relation to procurement issues.
Thanks so much, Rihanna. So at this point, I just quickly want to bring in some of the work of the Built Environment Integration Task Team, which is a group of practitioners that Rihanna and I convene with our colleague Civic to drive a practitioner-centric research agenda. And one of the projects that we've been working on is Setopoly, which is a board game based on quotes that came out of a research project. So I just want to share some of the quotes which are captured on the Setopoly cards before we start the session to kind of frame how practitioners are experiencing procurement, especially when it comes to spatial transformation projects. So I'm not going to read out all of these quotes, but you can see the type of sentiments that are raised in these verbatim quotes, and almost a kind of sense of fear that is governing the way that practitioners are behaving when it comes to procurement. So I think it's really interesting just to bring in the practitioner voice at this point, and get a sense of how the procurement system is experienced. Thanks, Rihanna.
And just before this session, there was actually a discussion happening on Twitter this morning in relation to issues of procurement. And as we were preparing for the session, Danga, you mentioned a little bit about the potential elephant in the room, which we can pick up after the video in the discussion. But maybe you just want to come in for 1 minute on the issue of the elephant in the room that we sometimes don't talk about when we're talking procurement.
Yes, thanks, Rihanna. I mean, one of the things I think that I think was made particularly evident in for example, Chippy Olver's book about Nelson Mandela Bay, and also, of course, in the ongoing commentary we see in the press, is that in many cases, procurement is a means for political parties through gaining contracts to take a certain percentage to fund their political activities. Political parties need funding. So whether it's through awarding a contract to a businessman who is then funds the party directly through the proceeds of that contract, or perhaps the party itself actually getting a contract through almost like a shelf company, if you will. I think this is one of the very important aspects of the way in which political activity is funded, and is essentially the elephant in the room that I think we need to discuss and find ways to deal with.
Thanks, Danga. So we asked, as Danga indicated, a range of colleagues to record a short video on their understanding of what's the biggest challenge in the municipal procurement system and what could be done differently. Do enjoy the views. So Sean is going to play the video.
Procurement is generally seen as an issue that plays itself out between a city, a successful bidder, unsuccessful bidders, the media if things turn sour, the Auditor General, and even the courts. And that is the ecosystem of procurement that we often speak about. We don't often speak about procurement as a municipality or a city using public funds to purchase goods or services on behalf of a community. And what is the role of that community in assisting the city to hold to account the service providers that have been appointed? Often all the attention goes to the award. Who was awarded the contract, at what price, and was due process followed? The key question is also what happens afterwards. Once the award has been made, does the service provider actually deliver? At the moment, we rely on cities' bureaucratic internal and external oversight mechanisms to monitor delivery. We do not place a lot of emphasis on the role of communities who can assist municipalities in holding service providers to account. Much like the International Budget Partnership is doing in its Asivikelane campaign, using social auditing on the ground to assess the performance of service providers. Because cities must realize that they are not always there. They cannot monitor and see everything that service providers do or do not do. If a service provider that is appointed to fill up water tanks in an informal settlement surreptitiously only fills it up halfway, or skips one round per week, it's for the communities. They will know exactly what happens, but city officials and city bureaucrats will have difficulties picking that up, and delivery will be signed off and the service provider will be paid. In order to make this happen, we need open contracting. We need more transparency on municipalities' websites and information on what has been procured, not just the price and who got it, but what is the detail of the contractual arrangement? What is the service delivery schedule? What have been the extensions, etc., etc. The Dalla Omar Institute is conducting research in partnership with the International Budget Partnership, examining how transparent municipal websites and city websites are when it comes to detailing what has been procured on behalf of residents in the city. particularly when it comes to service delivery contracts. We hope to release the results of that towards the end of the year. Thank you very much.
If I was to list one single problem or challenge within the public procurement context in South Africa and at the local government level, it would have to be the lack of transparency in the context. And the issue with an opaque procurement system is that it, on the one hand, increases the chances of misuse of funds and maladministration and corruption. And on the other hand, also means that there is this perpetuation of a closed-off system that is only understood by the elite or very few in business and in government, and that it creates a sense that procurement is beyond the understanding or the realm of engagement for regular citizens. So how to resolve that? There are already really encouraging steps being taken within the public procurement context, largely thanks to COVID-19. There's the draft procurement bill, which to some extent should be resolving issues of opacity within procurement. But perhaps some of the really exciting opportunities that exist are those which are about bringing in members of the public into, for example, the bidding space and as observers. So as part of the tendering process and contracting process, that information should be publicly available in machine-readable formats and in formats that are easy for anyone to understand. But more importantly, also ensuring that members of the public have opportunities to sit in, for example, in particular bidding meetings that are open to the public and should be open to the public. So the creativity with which members of the public can be brought in, and that people can begin to understand how procurement works and how it has a direct impact on their lives, exists and should be harnessed at this point. There is a lot of realm and scope, for example, for the use of social audits and social audits that are performed within the by ordinary members of the public should be contributing to ensuring that anti-corruption initiatives are strengthened in the space of procurement. So resolve transparency, make procurement a lot more open, make procurement a lot more engaging, make procurement a lot more understandable. There's no reason why procurement should be this really overly complex space. If more of us understand how procurement works, more of us can better understand and track when and how resources and promises are met.
The most important challenge facing municipal procurement system is that as a result of the fact that many people cannot get into the market economy, you find in many local areas very deeply embedded networks in which people use procurement in order to enrich themselves, in order to buy political support. And this is not because there are a few bad people. This is because, as I say, in the kind of economy we're stuck with at the moment, people want to get on, they want to advance, and they find they can't do it through the marketplace. Now, the most important thing that needs to change in order to deal with this problem is that the most effective tool that we have to fight corruption are citizens. If citizens have the information they need and the support they need and the protection they need, then it's going to be citizens who are able to hold the corrupt to account. Because research shows that very often citizens know who is doing what to who. So if we want to have more effective municipal procurement, if we want to have cleaner municipal procurement, then what we need to do is discuss ways of making sure that the relevant information gets to citizens, that the process is as open as possible and distributed as widely to citizens as possible, and that where citizens wish to take this up and hold government to account, they receive the necessary support they need from the various arms of government and from also civil society, which needs to protect those people who stand up for effective procurement systems?
I think one of the most critical is clearly the arduous process that organizations like ourselves have to follow in order to be registered as a supplier on the central database. And if you don't have access to data and information and all the necessary documentation, you literally will be cancelled out and your application will not be successful. It's by no means an easy process. I know 2 years ago I tried to register our own organization for some work that we could have done in a municipality, and we kept getting kicked out by SARS because for some or other reason they erroneously had loaded another organization onto our profile through no fault of ours, and to today we have still not been able to resolve the issue. We did go ahead and do the work in a particular municipality, but we had to then ask for the services of another NGO to assist us in order for us to do the work. So you can imagine the constraints that smaller organizations have that do not have access to data and social connections and colleagues who can assist them. That means they just immediately cancelled out of ever getting any work from a municipality. So there's a lot that communities, we feel, could be doing without having to follow all these arduous processes. Communities know what they want, they do understand, but often the gatekeepers within municipalities will not allow that, and that means that the work always tends to go to the organizations who are much more formalized, who have all the capacity, but may not even necessarily know the municipality well. So we feel that consulting with communities to get their buy-in, to hear what their aspirations are, and to work as true partners and not as service providers to communities. So there are opportunities, but there's a lot of paperwork to be followed, and if you don't have the resources as a small organization, then you literally are just sidelined. Often also we don't always understand the legislation and all the regulations that goes along with procurement, and the language that is used in these documents, which primarily is written in English, is often not understood. So I think much more education and awareness and sharing of information will go a long way in ensuring that civil society can truly benefit from what is available. For example, the granting aid that every municipality should have always seems to go to the same organizations because people are not made aware of the possibilities that they could access this. In every community, we believe there are assets. That's the approach that we use. And if we took the time to listen to the aspirations of community, I think our success rate will definitely be much higher than we're currently experiencing. So in a nutshell, I think definitely much more transparency, much more consultation at a community level, to also advise communities when there will be opportunities opened up that will allow for true partnership and better relationship building at a community level. Thank you very much.
To me, the biggest challenge in the current municipal procurement system is probably that we are not treating public procurement as a public service. And I think if more cities and local governments started to approach public procurement as a way to improve outcomes for communities, of using all the levers, the little opportunities the process gives us to improve the outcomes, we could really transform not just public procurement and the way we're doing our work, but importantly, we could also be transforming the outcomes we're getting. Related to this is that I think we're not asking ourselves the question enough, who would we really like to do business with? What is the relationship between local businesses, but also great ideas coming from the outside? How can citizens play a role? How can we nurture what maybe small organizations that share the public interest values we have into becoming credible vendors just 3 to 5 years down the line, so that we're gradually replenishing our ecosystem with partners to government that are also members of society, partners that share our values, and that really share a deep passion for solving the problems that our public spending is catering for, whether that is in infrastructure, in nutrition, health and food, whether that's in social care, whether that's an economic opportunity.
We recently hosted a learning forum on ethics in the procurement process as part of the Gauteng Municipal Integrity Project, together with the Gauteng Provincial Government. And one of the big issues that came from this workshop was sort of this disjuncture between the formal policies and the informal culture. It seems that, well, we all know that the policy environment is probably relatively strong in terms of public procurement, but it also seems that the informal culture is there to bypass a lot of the policies and procedures that have been put in place to ensure stronger governance. So, there's a lot of verbal instructions that are given to bypass things, to go towards certain outcomes. And this is frequently from top management, politicians, or also the end user department wanting things to go in a specific direction. So deviations and things like that become more standard practice, more normalized, and the culture develops where the policies and procedures are more easily bypassed. So how do we strengthen this? How do we move forward from that area? Two things, there's no short-term fix, let's just put it like that. But in terms of longer term, there's two things that seem to correlate to better governance. The one is more stable leadership, so not instability in top leadership, so more professional public service with longer serving municipal managers and governance staff. The other is more professional supply chain practitioners. So people who are well qualified, who are confident in their professional expertise, and who have a professional code and stand up for what is right. It's more likely for someone who is confident in their profession to stand up against manipulation of a process than it is for someone who isn't.
This is a topic that lies squarely at the heart of inclusive governance. And it also lies squarely at the heart of some of the weaknesses that have been identified in local governments and public institutions over time. And in our work, we have identified some of the game-changing interventions that are necessary to strengthen the role that civil society can play in social accountability, but also in strengthening inclusive local governance. And so I just want to take a few minutes to talk through those. And the first one is developing and publishing annual procurement plans. We are aware that there has been an effort to encourage public institutions to develop annual procurement plans. We're also aware that of the annual procurement plans that are developed by many municipalities across the country, including cities and district municipalities, that COCTA and Treasury had found the procurement plans to be of substandard. So we first are asking that of the annual procurement plans that are being developed, make them public. Secondly, make public Treasury and COCTA's comments on the same. It is almost impossible to evaluate the implementation of plans, development plans and implementation plans without looking at the annual procurement plans as well. And so developing these and making them public and making the Treasury and COCTA comments public is the first step in strengthening social accountability. The second one is access to information. In the same way that we were able as a country to collate and make public information on emergency procurement during COVID-19, we're asking that regularize that and make it the norm. Make all procurement in public institutions public, exactly in the detailed manner that we had done it during COVID-19. And then the third one is make service level agreements public. One of the key challenges that civil society and other players in the social accountability space have grappled with over time is accessing service level agreements, particularly in third-party implemented services. And we're asking that make these available, make them public, make consequences for non-compliance available, and implement consequences or consequence framework for non-compliance with information accessibility, because that hampers social accountability. It hampers inclusive governance. It hampers oversight. It undermines the spirit of the Constitution when it called for participatory local government. And so with that, I again just want to thank the South African Cities Network for facilitating this conversation. It is a timely conversation and it is a needed conversation at this time.
So thank you very much to all of our contributors, some who are on the call, some who couldn't make it. Kayla, did you just want to speak quickly to the word cloud that you've created based on the videos?
Sure, thank you, Rihanna. So we decided to make this word cloud after listening to the video because I think what struck us the most is that no matter from what sector these individuals are coming from, academic, private sector, civil society, there's so much similarity in what they're calling for. And I think there's a clear way forward and clear, concrete ideas for how we can improve the system. So I made this word cloud to kind of highlight some of the overlapping issues that are coming up through this video that were kind of repeatedly brought up by the different contributors.
Thanks, Kayla, for organizing that. And we have 3 of the video contributors in the room, but what Sean is going to do now is going to make all of you panelists so that we can all be in a generative conversation as opposed to just posing questions to panelists. So we have with us Bernie Dolly, who you met on the video from Ikala Trust. We also have Sasha Hasselmeyer, the CEO of CityMart, and we have Zukiswa from the Monitoring and Advocacy Program at Public Service Accountability Monitor. But the intention is really to open up the discussion, not necessarily for the 3 colleagues to be responding only to your questions. So as Danga had indicated up front, I will note virtual hands, but I think Andrea, you already kicked off in the chat box whilst the videos were playing, because the videos, interestingly, some were focusing, some of the inputs were focused very much on how we get better governance and oversight. And you had started and that had been picked up in other videos, comments then, but you had talked about how communities can co-participate on the management of services and the provision of services. So Andrea, do you want to come in just to kind of voice in the issues that you had raised in the chat? And then I also will note hands if other people want to step into the discussion. I am aware that we only have about an hour for a very complex, well, not so complex, but a very interesting discussion. And we want to bring in as many voices as possible. Andrea, over to you.
Thank you for the possibility to speak. I'm working in Cape Town and I'm involved in many civic activity. And we start a discussion around public procurement, particularly because the city of Cape Town is in the phase of review the policy about street people. And in one of the discussion, we start to have a discussion how we involve homeless or other people in need in some economic activity, because it's also time to try to put some social emergency in the economical activity, not just to make some social activity. So we start to look in, but it's possible to use the public procurement to have a particular project. In particular, we start to look at a pilot project to involve homeless people in the public maintenance of a green area like park. And so the idea is also to make able some NGO to set up sort of social enterprise like cooperative where the people start to make some activity. And so the thinking is how we can use, because generally we see the community just to look in, to monitor the service delivery. That is an activity very tiring because it's supposed that the citizen have a time and resources to look at what the city do and report back to the city. It's not working in a free activity where nobody paid them to make this kind of activity. And generally happen that they start some project and after a while, everybody go home. So I think in how we change the situation and how we make the community involved in this activity.
Thanks, Andrea. Whilst we're waiting for hands, Sasha, I know that the video questions were kind of very pointed, but it would be great just for you to give colleagues who are on the call a little bit of a sense of the work of CityMart. So Sasha, can we invite you in? And then I think we do have a hand after that. We have Nishendra. So Nishendra, I'm just going to allow Sasha and then take you. Sasha?
Yes, thank you, Rihanna, and great to see you all. And I don't want to take up a lot of time for this, but I would say our work focuses on helping governments use public procurement, honestly quite creatively, in the sense that we ask them to use it as a tool for solving problems by going out to the community to validate and frame the needs, but also then to broadcast not just the specific solution you want to buy, but the outcome you want to achieve, and attract a much broader potential vendor and supplier base. And I think in many of our experiences, the point that Andrea raised, we have seen some real success in communities beginning to shift from traditional vendors who may tick all the boxes, but have little else to offer, to shifting towards the kind of relationships we'd like to develop and cultivate. And I think this extends more than just the workforce, who's doing the work for what kind of hourly rate, but it's also about, in particular, when you deal with complex social problems or social care services, involving the people who have experiences with suffering a condition in providing the services to solve them. And I think that's a kind of, so I think there is this extends the idea of a social enterprise who employs people, but actually really tries to dig deep into the firsthand experiences. An example there is in the... Yeah.
I'm going to ask you to hold it there so that we can allow Nishendra to be in conversation. Nishendra, please come in.
Sure, thanks very much. Hoping you can hear me. Yeah, I'm here in my personal capacity, but speaking as someone who once was a municipal official, worked in a public interest consulting company for about 15 years, working mainly through the procurement and tender system, and then also having a stint as a national official in engaging a bit with the procurement system at a particular period in time. And also having played a role as an activist for transparency, accountability, and stronger social engagement. I see the purpose of a public procurement system as protecting or maximizing public value, particularly in purchasing goods and services, but quite explicitly for ensuring the achievement of developmental outcomes, which may be about the alleviation of poverty, decreasing inequality, and so on. And when looked at it in that way, I think that over the last 20 years, and particularly in our public sector system that we've set up through the MFMA and other tools and the procurement regulations, we've relied very heavily on technical controls. And I think that the evidence around the kind of elephant in the room that Danga was talking about earlier around the levels of extraction and leakage in the system have shown us that technical controls in themselves, whilst not always adhered to, certainly, but even when adhered to, are insufficient in being able to give us the developmental outcomes that we are desiring. And we know as well that these technical controls can be gained, right? And whenever we rely just on technical controls, those systems can be subverted. So I think lots of people here have made a strong argument already for why transparency, engagement, and I would add to that multi-stakeholder oversight over all procurement projects, and particularly depending on size and value, one can give that a certain level of formality, but we need to strengthen the systems, not just of making things transparent, but ensuring that there's an active interest on the part of government in making sure that there's mechanisms of external, particularly community and multi-stakeholder oversight. But I would argue that we've been over-reliant on technical controls, and that those technical controls only have meant limiting agility and creativity and achievement of developmental outcomes and interesting forms of partnering and co-production that could help us in the delivery of services.
Okay, Nishendra, I'm going to ask you to hold it there. And I wish we could, I really wish we had more time, because I would love to deepen some of these discussions. So Ashraf is raised in the chat, and Bernie and Zukiswa, I'm going to hand both Nishendra's input as well as Ashraf's question to the two of you. So Ashraf is saying, yeah, agree with what you're saying, but given the legislative context, constitutional issues, what needs to change? And can you begin to give definite ideas? And then Bernie, I guess this one is particularly interesting for you, whether NGOs and think tanks, which are supposed to hold government to account, should be offering services to government. So let's take Zukiswa, and then let's move to Bernie. Zukiswa?
Sorry, thanks. Yeah, thanks, Rihanna. Really quite fascinated by the inputs, and I think in particular around, I think what people are identifying about the co-production and co-creative space that procurement could potentially open up in many respects. I think, just reflecting on in particular what Nishendra was touching on, I wonder sometimes if there isn't a space to, on the one, I think I'll completely leave alone the procurement legislative and regulatory space, because that's a really scary space in some respects. But in terms of the principles of, on the one hand, direct civic engagement, but also direct civic input into what should be procured, how it should be procured, and what is procured, I think that's quite a meaningful space to potentially support. There is the technical side and the civic tech. I'm always interested to see how civic tech tools can support that kind of work. One example that I'm thinking of at the moment is a tool that we, in partnership with Open Up, who I know are part of this network, the Civic Tech Innovation Network, that is purely just tracking COVID-19 contracting information in this space across all provinces and across all departments. And the ideal situation would be where citizens and members of the public, generally speaking, are aware of what the procurement processes are adequately, that tool becomes a support, whether it is to kind of give input about actually this contract is meaningless, or these service level agreements, aren't on the ground meaningful. But I think at this point, the space, and I think I'm paraphrasing a bit what Nishendra was saying, there is that disconnect, and the disconnect is large enough that there isn't the space in which meaningful contribution to procurement accountability can be done, where in fact civic contribution has such value. And so there is that distinct remove where procurement, for me, from my perspective, is still very much a highly technical, even within the fragmented legislative space that it exists, highly technical enough that people simply are not within as they could be. But I do think there's a value for civic tech in creative ways. And I know that the creativity aspect is what we're trying to explore.
Thanks, Zukiswa. So I know that Ashraf is still pushing us through the chat box. And at some point, we're going to have to bring Ashraf's voice in, because you can hear, as a municipal practitioner, he's saying, very nice, agree with everything you guys say, but you cannot ignore the legislative matters. But let's allow Bernie, and then I'm going to bring Ashraf and Umpo into the conversation. Bernie?
Okay, so maybe I'll kick off by saying maybe therein lies the elephant in the room, is the legislative framework that precisely excludes people or includes depending on your level of understanding. And part of me feels a bit frustrated because we seem to kind of constantly be going round and round and round, grappling with issues. And I know that it was obviously excluded from the video, but I was saying to somebody the other day that I've been involved in the sector, well, the not-for-profit sector, for about 30 years, and it's like we're having the same conversations. So what's holding us back? What is that elephant? What are those things? And yes, 30 years later, a little bit older, there's a whole lot of new people in the space, but we seem to be having the same conversation. So what is it? What is it that is stopping us? Or why is it that, is there a fear factor around really taking government and municipalities and officials on around what we all are not happy about? So part of me is like, why are we struggling? Where is that elephant? Or where are the elephants, put it that way? And why is it that we don't seem to be able to get over these hurdles? And yet we've got great, smart thinkers and people with immense expertise in this area, coming from different sectors, but we don't seem to be able to be moving forward. And I like the whole idea of the multi-stakeholder approach. And if I think about a success story that really makes my heart sing, that is happening about 3.5 hours from Port Elizabeth, and what's happening in that little town, that's exactly what I believe multi-stakeholder approaches to procurement, and allowing communities to take the lead and dictate what they want is part of the success in this particular town. And we are writing that up, because I think, especially in the Eastern Cape, if that's what we could follow, it's not a blueprint, but where the community itself stepped forward and said, we know what we want here, and we will invite you in for what we cannot do, but we have levers already. And it's been amazing what's been happening there. I cannot believe it. And I'm excited, because I think if that's the way we could do it, and there was no procurement in place, there was none of that, but basically the mayor heard about it and said, I like what you're doing. My goodness, that's something we should have been doing. I can actually, support you. I can't give you money, but tell us what it is that you require in order to actually grow what you're currently doing. And so maybe that's an answer. I don't know, but
so Bernie, right, I'm going to ask you to hold it. I'm going to ask you to hold it there, because there's a parallel discussion that's starting in the chat to say, but there is a procurement bill on the table. So Zukiswa, Nishendra, you want to come in? Will this procurement bill change anything? Because I think that there are two sets of issues I'm hearing coming through the conversation. The one is about transparency, openness, the ability to interrogate how public funds are being spent. But there's also another school of thought that's saying, how do we open procurement beyond the usual suspects, and people who have ideas can begin to provide services to the public sector with minimal obstacles. And maybe those are two separate things. So Zukiswa, Nishendra, you want to come in on the procurement bill?
Yeah,
I think I'll let Nishendra go first.
Thanks, Zukiswa. Yeah, I mean, the procurement bill is on the table, and it does, as I said, I think pursue the kind of current government trajectory, which is about strengthening controls in the fight against corruption. It doesn't at all use the opportunities for increasing transparency and citizen oversight in that process. And so here you have a piece of legislation in the making, not a law that we have to as yet implement, but in the making, and that civil society and others have an important role in helping to shape this bill to the intended purpose of the procurement system.
So Zukiswa, I don't know if you want to come in, because Sasha's saying, and this is from international experience, that everywhere that City Mart has worked, people quote the law, but it's not always the legislative environment. So Zukiswa, do you want to go first, or shall I bring Sasha in at this point?
I think just very quickly, Rihanna, I mean, we made quite like a super detailed submission on the draft procurement bill, precisely for the reasons that we feel it's a really important opportunity to influence and kind of, you know, especially the transparency aspects. And I know that hundreds of other organizations and individuals did the same, like really well-considered, detailed, well-researched submissions on the bill. And one of the areas that was a primary concern for us was exactly, you know, the recognition, even by, you know, the drafters of the bill, that the issue of fragmentation, the issue of overly restrictive, you know, procurement processes are exactly anti-developmental in a sense, are not progressive. And so now I guess the next step is to see the extent to which all of those amazing inputs will be factored in or not factored in a really, yeah, in a manner that transforms procurement and you know, procurement regulation. The optimistic side of me feels that if those you know, suggestions are really engaged with, there is hope. But on the other hand, yeah, there is also concerns about the extent to which the engagement process, and, you know, as we all say, what is the likelihood of some of these really, I guess, radical sometimes suggestions and submissions, what is the ease with which those will be taken on, given capacity constraints and all other political questions. So I think it's a great opportunity, and I also would say maybe the context of COVID-19 and announcements around transparency and inclusion, maybe we should leverage those in real ways right now. And there is still time, I guess.
Okay, I know Andrea has posted about the city of Barcelona and some of what they've done, so colleagues can read that. Sasha, can we take you, and then Frans van der Walt, who has made some specific recommendations in the chat.
Yeah, so I guess the point I was making is that we have worked in well over 100 cities in 35 countries on all continents, and we've never found legislation to stand in the way of good procurement. That doesn't mean that legislation cannot raise the bar generally, but really we found very few laws that stop us from doing the right things right now. And I think it's important to kind of make that distinction, that we can lift the practice right now if we motivate the people. And you know, this question about formal policies versus informal culture, about this dominant compliance culture where people are feel encouraged only to not make a mistake, but there's no what is good look like how do I exceed that expectation, how do I do something meaningful? And that's what we call the purpose in procurement, to say that procurement is not a clerical function in government that is only governed by transparency and accountability, but is also a public service that actually means everything you do, you can take things further to the positive. I would maybe add, just as a kind of side comment, in Europe, the social procurement clauses, they're really not very much about reshaping our economies. They don't come with a strong vision for the economy. They're simply evaluation criteria that are added. I think we're talking about something much more progressive here in terms of how do we really create the kind of procurement ecosystem where we begin to do business with the kind of organizations we would love to have at the table that shape this. And I think anyone who's interested in cases and maybe looking at the city of Wigan, the Wigan deal in the UK, is a very interesting example without going into detail, but it's also well documented as to what the city did there in response to the severe budget cuts and austerity of the last 10 years to really build an asset-based community development approach to procurement that is really interesting.
Thanks, Sasha. Franz, you're raising stuff that's making us think that even as the bill is in process, it's more likely to be more of the same. I mean, I'm just horrified that there's no provision for e-procurement, for example. Do you want to come in? And I want to invite in Ashraf as a municipal practitioner, just to raise some of the views around procurement from the perspective of a CEO of a development agency at Nelson Mandela Bay. But let's take Franz and then Ashraf. And I know that we still have to come to Mpho.
Good morning, everybody. The sound comes through fine. Yes, as I mentioned, the draft procurement bill was circulated, and I, being part of the ASAQS, Association of Quantity Surveyors, we got a workshop going and considered the document as it was presented, the draft document. And just going through the current practices within all the public bodies that is putting out tenders, procurement for various opportunities, it is clear that there is a misunderstanding or not an understanding exactly of what is required, first of all, from the requirement of the client as to what facilities or whatever infrastructure they need to establish. If I look at the tender documentation that currently goes out, it is so generic that in most instances, you as a person that want to participate or tender on that bid cannot comprehend what it is. I've got results from tenders from the DBSA and from some TVET colleges recently. And if I look at the submissions of prices, the ranges, in one instance, the lowest price was 11 million and the highest price was 188 million. and there was 57 submissions. Now, to my mind, that clearly illustrates that the scope, the brief that was contained in the tender document did not clearly dictate or illustrate what the requirements is. And that's why people then have to make assumptions. Some include some of those assumptions and some exclude those assumptions. So a huge challenge that we see is that the scope of works, as one calls that, is so vaguely defined that you cannot make sense of it. So you have to, as a commercial business entrepreneur, cover yourself in risk, and that's why those prices are going up so high. Then one finds, and this is a huge challenge that we see in the construction sector, that tenders currently from the DBSAs, ESCOMs, and most other public entities at the moment goes out on team tenders, where they put up a team. You need to make a multidisciplinary team to be considered for the submission. Now, you tell me how you select two national rugby teams, if you want to call it like that, which has previously not played together. And now you want to put them and force them to be part of a team to submit the tender. Your challenges that's going to come out of that is how do you compare those two teams with one another. A team of architects, a team of quantity surveyors, a team of civil engineers, structural engineers, and all the disciplines that goes into that. How do you compare two unrelated teams with one another? Now you've got 57, like I said in that one tennis instance, and that was for a project in Majuba, Newcastle, which is, I mean, very far. So that is a low number of participants. You cannot compare those with one another. So it comes from that. Then another tender that we saw where they have weightings for the specific disciplines to be involved in the project. Where they weigh, as an example, the architect, they give him a 15% weighting, the engineer, they give a 7.5%, the quantity surveyor, they give a meager, low, pathetic. If you think about the role and responsibility of the QS on public finance control, they give him a 2.5%, and then they come with a health and safety component specialist, which is nothing to do with design, that's got a 15% weight. Now, I mean, do you want the bridge to stand, or don't you want the bridge to stand? Do you want the bridge to be healthy,
okay,
or what? So those are challenges. People don't understand what they want and the complexities. They need to stop pulling those teams, because you cannot compare teams with one another. Thank you.
Okay, so Frans, I mean, I think you're raising some real detailed, specific issues. Umpo, I want to bring you in, and then Ashraf, very cognizant of the time and the fact that we're probably just at the tip of the iceberg of this discussion. Umpo, let's take you. You've raised some very specific issues around performance and consequence management at all levels. Do you just want to come in quickly?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yes, I think in my view and my experience, I'm based in Rustenburg, Northwest Province. And, you know, there's a space to improve legislation and how municipalities conduct its work. But my experience and those who I interact with is that the implementation and the adherence of certain things are not, you know, the compliance by officials to the law, it's not always to point. People are not held accountable in terms of performance, and also people who want to make a difference in government, they are unable to do that because they are constrained by interference of politicians who tend to give verbal instructions. And these people, you know, who want to add value, they end up being frustrated and leaving government. And then you have people who don't know what they are doing sometimes. It doesn't happen in all municipalities, but we tend to see that happening. You know, and that impedes participation by you know, local SMEs. If you don't give somebody, or if you don't give a politician something who sits on a council of the municipality, you know that you're not going to get anything at the lower level. So the politicians have a way of breaking through the veil and giving instructions. And also the officials are scared because their jobs are not secured. So they either do nothing or they follow these verbal instructions because for some reason, you know, they are seeking job security. So there's this, you know, implementation paralysis, you know, even if we make better laws. I'm not saying there's no space for better legislation, but I think on the ground implementation and general good governance also impedes, you know, inclusion of, you know, of procurement. Thank you.
Thanks, Umpo. Ashraf, are you able to come in both in relation to the questions you've raised, but any answers you might have to some of the issues that you've raised, because we're all in this together and we're going to have to navigate this stuff together, and they're just layers, right?
Okay.
Ashraf?
Thank you. I've got a few points I'd like to raise, and if you don't mind just giving me a few minutes. And it seems to me that we're having the same type of discussion that is being held on spatial transformation. You know, we discuss problems as they present themselves, rather than come and then come up with technological solutions instead of understanding the underlying causes and then the various options and solutions that come out of that. And the reason for me is clear. It's easier to do that and to say what needs to be done than to engage with the everyday challenges of governance. Now, I participated in a discussion the other day on public participation. And I asked a very simple question to all the panelists. How many of you attend IDP and budget meetings in your wards? And none of them did. But yet all of them waxed lyrical on, on public participation. And I think that's an issue that we need to begin to address. How do we as researchers and policy influencers understand what is really going on? And I think that we are discussing insufficient public participation. And the solutions are actually not technological, as some people are presenting it to be. And I mean, a simple question I would have my simple response, for example, on the issue of the NGO and SARS, why should a municipality be dealing with that? A municipality should be helping you procure, train people, understand the systems, understand the procurement systems, and so on and so forth. And there are many successful examples of that. But why should a procurer deal with your issues around SARS? And so public procurement is required to be public, including which companies have been appointed. It's there in the law. So the fact that it is not happening is the issue. And yet we are complaining that it is not happening. The question is not that it is not happening, why is it not happening? I work within the legislative regime every day. And I agree that it needs to be tweaked. And I can point to many examples where good procurement processes start with good terms of reference, which are informed by a solid understanding of what needs to change. And if you look at what value people in the policy industry are bringing to municipalities, especially in what problems need to be solved, then you find the terms of reference resulting from there are themselves weak. And therefore your procurement is going to be an issue. And I think that linked to that is the issue of corruption amongst many firms, including consulting firms, and the role that corruption plays in public sector corruption. So I think that it is quite frustrating, actually, as a public official, to hear this kind of thing, where people have the same conversation that's been had for 10, 15 years already, nothing new, because the regime has been there. I've been looking at these things for the past 20 years, actually, and I've changed my perspectives based on pure experience within the public sector. So I really find it difficult to hear the kinds of and see the word cloud absent of a context of the regime in which we are operating. So we do need that kind of value in research that tries to inform how we need to be more transparent. Of course, we can be more transparent, and we must be. But the reason it is not happening lies not in what you are saying. You are just saying what is not happening. We need to understand the movement.
So Ashraf, the one part is transparency, right? But the other part, increasingly, that I mean, I think from the research work that has been done in the Built Environment Program, is access to economic opportunity, and that certain parts of society just don't believe that they're ever going to get the chance to do business with the state. And so then you have the establishment of business forums and then the holding up of projects. So, I mean, can we separate the transparency from the economic opportunity? And are we realistically in the public sector creating space for new entrants who can do the work? We're not saying give the work to people who can't, but are we just under the guise of the legislation gatekeeping and keeping others out? So I'm really interested in the economic transformation component of this conversation.
That's a good question. I'd like to respond to that. Firstly, the law and the policies allow for that. Secondly, we need to locate that issue of access to why people want to be councillors and shoot other people to become councillors, why people want certain jobs, why they form themselves into these things. If you look at it, you need to consider it in the context of structural unemployment, which this government has been part of in enabling. So people are not naturally criminals. Most people are not naturally criminals. There are certain material conditions that drive people to particular positions, and you need to understand that. In our work at the MBDA, in the last 2 years, we have had not one stoppage by so-called SMMEs and some of these business forums. Why? Because we work with them. We train people on how to have basic gradings in construction industries development board gradings, how to tender for our work, how to understand our work. We teach people in basic public participation so that when they do get some of our work, they can engage with the public themselves. So it's that kind of thing. So it's not the law, and we do this all in terms of the law, by the way. We've got a policy that says, even though government policy says that minimum 30% to SMMEs, if we can give 100%, we will do that. So the issue is not that the law or the system is not there. What is it? And I think that by discussing it in the absence of structural unemployment and the role of the state in dealing with structural unemployment is a fundamental point. Because if you don't, you're going to have the problem. If I could just give you, just as an ending thing, one example is an area we work in controlled by gangs. One gang member or one gang group cannot traverse to go to another. We've trained some of those people to the point where we agreed, okay, you might not get work here now, but in the next phase, you'll get work. And we were successful in that. In fact, one project is ahead of schedule because one of the guys who led it is a guy who orders hits. So I really think that unless you understand the depth and the detail of why things happen and don't happen, you are always going to sit at this level of generality. And I really want to plead, because I've sat in a few sessions now where we are stuck at this level of generality, and it's not going to take us very far.
So Ashraf, I mean, on the procurement bill, the public procurement bill then, given that it's been part of this discussion, what can this collective of people who are on this call, in their individual capacities as a collective, what can be done? Is it going far enough?
I haven't read it. Mea culpa. I haven't read it, and I will now go and read it. My advice is, and you will find most institutions are not averse to this, that when we are trying to engage with these kinds of stuff, spend some time in an institutions. Go and ask a municipality, any municipality, whether it's a good one or a weak one, to be part of a process. Because you can sit in as observers in supply chain processes, by the way. It is quite possible for the public to be involved in supply chain management processes, which are internal to municipalities. We get objections all the time. So I think that if you spend that, sorry, am I sounding as if I'm lecturing? I hope it's not my intention. But I
think we want an insight of you, Ashraf, which is why I'm giving you.
I think there's value in spending time in institutions, observing close at hand how the processes happen, how terms of references get developed, on what basis, who informs it, and you'll find it's the same engineering consultants, it's some of the same planning consultants, it's some of the same firms, and all of them say the same things. And so that's something which you really need to observe in a lot more detail, and you'll find that your policy recommendations will be a lot more effective.
Okay, I'm noting 2 hands. Thanks for that, Ashraf. Sandile, can we take you, and then Andrea, and then I'm going to hand back to our panelists for some final observations. Sandile?
Thank you, Chair. I'd just like to touch on what the speaker before me just mentioned. Sorry, and I just forgotten to take down your name. My apologies. But SEM or the public procurement system, it's quite a very dynamic system which is evolving like any other living organization or organism. And the challenge with that is that, you know, on the one end, it's dealing with the demand side factors, and on the other end, it's dealing with supply side factors. But then with the change in legislation, it requires effective change management, because what we find is that amongst procurement practitioners, and that could even be, I'll make an example, within your bid committee structure, the manner in which the legislation or the regulations and the policies interpreted, it varies. So you have inconsistent interpretation of policy and inconsistent application of policy, and that's one of the biggest problems that we have internally. And then you have regulations like the preferential procurement regulations, which speak to the point that you were asking, Chair, about how do we bring about economic transformation within our society. Now, those regulations basically empower organs of state and public practitioners to be able to effectively ring fence opportunities in specific areas for specific objectives. So you have things like your pre-qualification criteria, which actually build into your terms of reference, where so if you look at the how projects are built up into contracts, that whole scoping or needs analysis process, which is done by the project manager, should include things like socioeconomic analysis study, which ought to be done by the project manager, whether he does it in-house or he outsources that. But that needs to be done to such a level whereby the project manager, before he goes to your bid specification committee, he has an understanding of what can be achieved in that particular ward or area, the capabilities of that supply market or people that are within that particular ward, and also identify where the socioeconomic imbalances lie within that particular ward, and define the empowerment strategy for that particular project. And that, amongst other things, includes engagements with the public along with the councillors at a ward level, so that you demystify all of the the uncertainties and all of the myths that come about when new projects come into an area. I'm from eThekwini municipality, and we are not the best case example, but we do have some good success stories that relate to how projects can be effectively introduced into communities and where you get buy-in from communities. However, on the same token, the change management for me has been a sore point, because I don't think we've effectively communicated and brought everyone onto the same level in terms of how we can achieve specific objectives. Like sustainable procurement is encompassed within the regulations. You've got an objective criteria which speaks to green procurement. Now, if the projects aren't going to be scoped correctly and the terms of reference aren't going to specifically target organizations that can improve the carbon footprint of the municipality or whichever public institution it may be, then you are going to get the wrong suppliers being appointed. You are going to get the wrong outcomes. So you need to begin with the end in mind when you undertake any procurement events. And that's where we've come short. And another thing is that the review of these processes and internal controls are not being done regularly. And because they're not being done regularly, you've got a very old system that embraces very old and loose processes that have weak controls that time and time again will produce the same audit findings year in, year out. And the challenge with the public sector has been that they're very paper-driven, very they're driven. There's a lot of
Sanjay, can I give you one more
bureaucracy.
minute?
Okay.
Can I give you one more minute?
Okay, I'm summing up now. So the process is quite bureaucratic, and we actually don't have research support that will help to inform how we develop new systems or develop a new way of thinking within the public procurement space, because it does honestly need a fresh mind, a different perspective, innovative thinkers, people that align procurements with the SDGs. And at the moment, we don't see any correlation between public procurement and the SDGs. It's just a matter of people using the same tender documents and templates that they've used time in and time again. And that's hence why we're getting the same results. But public procurement is for me, it is an enabler for us to bring about economic growth. if it's utilized correctly. Thank you.
Thanks, Sandile, and really interested to engage you further. And the person who spoke before you was Ashraf Adam from the CEO of the Mandela Bay Development Agency. Andrea, I see you've posted into the chat, and I'm guessing that's in relation to the procurement bill. So can I give you 2 minutes very quickly before we hand over to our panelists for some last comments?
I'm very short because Sandile said exactly what I busy saying. I agree with him. I think also the new law has some space where we needed to enter. That is the chapter 4. So the question is to create a specific procurement system that is work for the community. So I don't think so we came out with a system that work for big company, building and community in one side. It's a nightmare. But in this phase, I'm very short, I not care about the business. It's their problem, they have more ability to deal in. I think we need to create a space where we use the procurement system to engage with the community, have an innovative project in this aspect.
Super. So I think we are getting in this session some consensus on kind of real practice and what this could mean for practice, but also transforming practice. I'm going to allow now our panelists, our contributors. Bernie, some 2 minutes to you for kind of closing comments and observations based on this discussion.
Yeah, I think, you know, I'm not often stumped for words, but my head's busy spinning with all kinds of stuff. And the language, even the language that was used now, and for me, maybe my thinking is too simplistic. And we keep talking about community in relation to all of this, and who is the community that we are talking about. And so I'm really struggling with, okay, so what is the answer? What is the actual issue that we grappling with? And I'm not clear that I have any idea of what that is. And it's probably going to need further engagement for us to make any progress. But I do go back to that there are opportunities for co-creation, co-production, co-investment. And again, where I come from, you know, applying the principles of an asset-based, citizen-led development approach, even in the procurement. So before you even get there, how do you engage community to co-produce something that they feel ownership of? Because I think that is the issue. It's often when we get to community, it's too late. We've already decided for them, and then expect them to partner and to embrace what it is that needs to happen. So I go back to, you know, the point that communities are left out. They brought in too far down the line. And so I'm trying to get my head around where do they fit into all of these processes. Thank you, Rihanna.
Bernie, thanks for your honesty, and sorry that the session is leaving you somewhat overwhelmed, but hopefully some of that clarity will emerge as we move things forward. Sasha, over to you. 2 minutes, closing thoughts.
Yeah, so I have to say I'm sharing a little bit of the kind of mental storm that's happening. It seems to be happening in Bernie's head also. But I would like to just point out a couple of things. So one is that one of the big challenges we see over and over, and I think it trickles through this conversation, is that we usually expect government to engage communities, and then somehow it becomes an additional task on the to-do list for everyone in government. And to do good community engagement, really, first of all, there is a right way to do it and everything else is wrong. So we need to accept that 99% of the ways we're doing community engagement are not truly effective. And so I think it's important that we agree on what is our minimum standard of community engagement, that it's not open data alone, that it's not just posting things, but that it's actually involving people. And the second is then to really invest in that process and understand what capacity do we need to do this at scale. One example is that we're currently helping the city of Mexico City procure their public bicycle system. And every stage of the process, we've done community engagement. We've posted the terms of reference for public engagement, for example, for the entire bicycle system, the entire documentation. And that's on the one hand, that's extra work, but on the other hand, also you see the limitations. It's not enough to just post it. You actually, if you wanted to do this well, you would go out into the community, and doing that in a city of more than 20 million people is not a trivial task. The bicycle team is 5 people, you know, they probably never be able to actually see all the bike stations they're procuring. So I think unless we're reconciling this, it's going to be difficult, but I would always say, let's not start by saying what is possible with the current operation we have. And that's where I would always like to emphasize the laws are there and they do what they do, but actually building the capacity to do more is actually really central in procurement, community engagement, and contract management. And I would really advocate for holding your political leadership accountable for giving you the resources to do what they evidently say they want you to do and get it done.
Thanks, Sasha. Okay, so I know you have to run off because you had some issue, but can I give you 1 minute? I know you've shared something in the chat as well, and just your reflections before I hand over to Kayla to move it to closure. Zukiswa?
Yeah, sorry, just less than a minute from me, which is just to say that I think perhaps the most exciting aspect of this period is the value that's been shown by civic engagement, and in particular the opportunities around social audits contributing to kind of increasing transparency and accountability and inclusion in procurement processes at the local government level. So that, for me, I think is a bright spark or a great opportunity, and many have shown that it works.
Thanks, Zukiswa. So Sadhna has also posted into the chat a feedback form. If we could please ask you to complete that feedback form. So I'm not feeling particularly overwhelmed. I actually think this has been a very productive 1.5 hour discussion. But maybe that's just me. Kayla, over to you to close it. But my sense is that we've delved both at the legislative level, but also into practice, and that there is space in practice to be creative in how we empower the civic through the procurement system. But Kayla, over to you.
Thanks so much, Rihanna. I think maybe perhaps some of the thought storms that are going on are kind of natural when there's this kind of tension between two kind of issues when it comes to procurement. So on the one hand, there's almost this problem of corruption and the elephant in the room based on informal relationships, networks of power and patronage that circumvent the legislation and the MFMA and some of the formal rules. But then on the other hand, there's civil society saying the rules of procurement are too arduous and are barring small grassroots organizations who are sometimes the ones who are best placed to carry out the work from playing a part. But I think what everyone is saying is that there is kind of the solution, and it's thinking through this that perhaps is the key to solving it. And I think that lies with an empowered civic. And what does that mean in this context? And I think what I'm hearing from all the panelists and everyone who's spoken on the call is that it means a civic that is informed, so through information that's transparent, easy to access. It's a civic that's involved. So an example is being part of the bidding processes as observers, as Ashraf spoke about, being part of social auditing to increase accountability, as Zuki spoke about, being included, so being a player in the game when it comes to accessing the economic opportunity. And this is around the language and the accessibility of information, awareness and education about the types of opportunities that exist. And I think Bernie has made this point so well. So that way, communities, small businesses, grassroots organizations can really play a much more central role in both holding service providers and municipalities to account, but can also bid to get the work in a much fairer context. So Rihanna, just to close for 1 minute, I just want to share a concept that we've been doing research over the last year in the BATE, and that's this idea of the written rules and the unwritten rules. And I think this comes in so clearly where you have these very strict, arduous written rules, but then there's also the unwritten rules, the informal relationships, the networks of power and patronage when it comes to procurement, and knowing when to turn a blind eye. And I think all of this creates a particular institutional culture that we've only kind of briefly touched on, and that culture is kind of dominated by fear, and where there's fear, we also know there's a lack of creativity and a tendency to play it safe. But I think despite this difficult environment, I think there are really like amazing and creative ideas that are being put forward by our panelists and by the kind of work that Sasha is doing at CityMart that can really help to make a procurement system that is much more transparent and inclusive. Thanks, Rihanna.
So thanks, colleagues. My sense is that we might want to, as Cities Network, really take a much deeper dive into understanding what's going on in the procurement system and how do we build two things, accountability and economic transformation, that those are not necessarily mutually exclusive, and how do we get communities to become partners in relation to measuring the outputs from service providers. I mean, I think there's some really strong views that came through on the video. So colleagues, thank you very much. We've taken 1 minute more of your time than we promised, but thank you so much for joining us. Thanks to the team behind the scenes who've been holding all of the tech, Danga and the team from governance. Thank you, Zukiswa, Sasha, Bernie, and all of our participants who hopped onto the call. Been great having you here, and please do join some of our other sessions at the Urban Festival.
Thank you.
Be downloading, which is something that will not be available the Treasury.
Sandile?
That is not gonna be.
Sandile, there's a session that City Support Program are hosting on Tuesday on green economic recovery. If there's any chance you're available, it would be great if you were able to join that call.
Sandile, you're on mute.
You're on mute, Sandile.
Yeah, sorry about that. If you could share the details with me, and then I'll get back to you guys.
Does someone have Sandile's? Yeah, we should be able to get from Sean, right? Okay, we'll do, Sandile. I'll find a way to track you and share that with you. Brilliant.
Pleasure.
Thanks.
Thanks again.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.